You heard my rather cumbersome phrase, but I really like my cumbersome phrase. The first time we can make more effective medications than we can afford. Most people's lifetime earnings do not reach the current price of Kymriah. And the phrase I'd like to comment on first is one which has been used to describe these therapies. I think we all understand that if Kymriah or Yescarta or the JCARs and the BB2121s down the road become second-line or first-line treatments, absolutely the healthcare system is going to save a lot of money on the BMTs that don't happen, the radiotherapy, the chemotherapy, the surgery that doesn't happen. Never mind the societal impact of these patients being unable to work and contribute to society as they would wish to. And the phrase is, yes, cost-effective, but unaffordable.
So that's a really loaded question. So that's you framed that as a question.
There was
Anthony?
a question mark at the end of
Good.
that sentence.
Okay. So can I ask the audience, do I have one request for help?
I love doing that, yeah. You have your lifeline.
Thank you. So this is an important topic, and I think is a corollary to your introductory remarks before our first speakers. This is an extraordinary time to be sitting here for all of us to participate. So great advances have been made to treat patients, to save lives. The question, of course, goes to cost, and Tom raised in his case that he had excellent coverage to be able to care for Emily. I think as we look to the future, now that specialty drugs have become in focus for payers, which wasn't the case only 5 years ago. Specialty drugs represented maybe 10% of the spend. It's now getting closer to 45%. So from the payer side, this is in focus. So what do we do about it? One, we have ICER in the US who assesses quality-adjusted life years. We have NICE, GBA IQWiG in Germany, NICE in the UK. At the end of the day, we're talking about saving lives with very expensive therapy now because the cost of goods for many cell therapies and gene therapies are extraordinarily expensive, especially for autologous manufacturing, for example, and I think we all appreciate that. So I think there are a few solutions, and some that I will suggest. We are, as you know, Anthony, having active dialogue with certain of the pharmaceutical companies, the biopharmaceutical companies, and then ultimately, I hope, government. So there are a few approaches, assuming that quality-adjusted life years is sufficient to convince payers. But setting that aside, how do we, the Oregon experience of 2 decades ago, how do we really assess that? And frankly, I think healthcare is as much a right, especially when you're talking about a child who otherwise has a lifetime ahead of them. So a few approaches. I think one, the capital markets, the private sector, and government, the public sector, have to work together. So one of the things that we're talking about, especially as we're looking hopefully forward this year to Novartis's approval in SMA, other gene therapies, curative therapies, maybe lentiglobin as well. How do we pay for $2 to $5 to $6 million curative therapies, one-time therapies? So one is for government to provide a backstop, at least a partial backstop. Two is to look to the capital markets the way we have for other structured finance approaches, structured products that would be attractive to pension funds, endowments, multi-strat funds, hedge funds, where if you recall Bowie bonds, where that was a structured product against the sales of tickets of David Bowie, and it's not because of our friends at Phacilitate that I mentioned Bowie, I was a fan. We can take that same approach to trying to figure out how to pay for risk, if you will, in that way. The other thought that we have is that the insurers come together with risk pools. So there are risk corridors and risk pools that have been established currently, but where we think about having the insurers, the payers, all contribute to a risk pool, where if a patient happens to move between plans and requires a therapy for SMA or RPE or for sickle cell or beta thalassemia or for a range of cancers, solid tumors, hopefully ultimately addressing the microenvironment, and currently hematologic tumors, liquid tumors, what about contributing to a risk pool where United Healthcare and Cigna and WellPoint and Aetna all come together to contribute so those therapies can be funded and it doesn't associate with substantial risk for any one plan if they have several patients within that plan. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. I can tell you that some of the pharmaceutical companies are thinking about that as well. Of course, the concept of value-based pricing. So, what if the next gene therapy is not curative? What if that is, truncated because it's a very long gene and is unable to be fully delivered, for example, which is the case in certain indications, more neuromuscular indications now. Well, if you're taking a young boy from DMD status to Becker's, that's a huge advance in neuromuscular disease and disorders in the case of Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, but maybe not curative. So how do we look to the capital markets, to government, and then finally, reinsurance. So there are reinsurance companies that reinsure risk, whether it's catastrophic risk to manufacturing facilities or other property, plant and equipment. Why can't we work, the insurance companies, with reinsurance and maybe with government as a backstop and the capital markets to come up with an approach that, that shares that risk? So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer.
There's a lot to unpack there. So let me, as a card-carrying engineer with no financial expertise whatsoever, other than the allowance my wife gives me, let me try and unpack a few of those things. So for example, we're seriously thinking about amortized payments. We're seriously thinking about not having to write the check for $400,000 or $500,000 on the day of treatment. Is that something which most people are now comfortable with in your experience?
So I'm not sure that I would say most people are comfortable. I would say amortizing the cost of CAR T therapy, for example, if that's the example as compared to curative gene therapy. I think probably gene therapy will be maybe the first test case for truly amortizing costs over and I know we have our friends from Novartis here, perhaps Gilead and other companies where this is highly relevant.
Listening very carefully, I might.
Yes, and I can feel the eyes on me right now. So I think that amortizing the cost is something that certainly the pharmaceutical industry should think about as a solution to treating as many patients who need therapy as possible. I think the capital markets have some role and responsibility to play in that regard and can do that collaboratively in conjunction with the innovators who are bringing these critically important therapies to our patients. So
it's not only amortizing the payment, but it's performance-based pay.
So I think we are
ongoing monitoring of the patients to ensure that they still ought to have to pay.
So I think we are clearly heading in that direction. If the question of affordability is one that we are all proactively thinking about, value-based, outcomes-based reimbursement, we're already seeing that with certain pharmaceutical companies in conjunction with PBMs and payers here in the US. There are some examples of that. I think we're going to continue to see that. And similar to the private equity industry or the venture capital industry, where there can be clawback of performance if performance isn't there, I think this is something we all must think about and consider as part of the future of reimbursement, is, if you will, pay for performance or reimburse for value.
So when you talk about risk, some of the risks that have already become apparent in what you just said were that the patient during this extended period of essentially follow-up changes insurers. What if the patient disappears, stops showing up for their checkups. Who's paying that bill? And that is the destination for these risk pools, perhaps, which you're suggesting.
Yes, that's a perfect example, Anthony. So, and especially in a case where you have a patient who is in remission, relapses or becomes refractory, maybe during remission that therapy is paid for by one payer, and then the patient relapses and is now insured by another payer. Why not think about risk pools in that way? Why not spread the risk, share the risk, and at the same time be able to treat patients who desperately need these therapies? I mean, Tom and I were talking just before the panel. Tom received a text from a mother whose child has ALL, I believe, had been in remission, became refractory to all other therapies, and has good news today based on, as I understand, a new vector to target CD22, and has negative minimal residual disease now. That's extraordinary. What if she were on one insurance plan, paid for performance, in remission, relapses, and now is on another plan? We should look to save that young girl's life in this case. And that's a wonderful example of why we're all here as well.
And you actually, so these risk pools, you actually believe they could be effectively securitized?
I do. I think the capital, where there's an opportunity, it may sound cynical, where there's an opportunity for yield to be had, for returns to be had in the capital markets, I think we absolutely can come up with tranches or slices of risk, work with insurers, potentially work with government as a backstop to be able to fund these therapies. And not so much an advertisement for our firm, but this is something we're very focused on in terms of advising and structuring and helping to come up with a solution, both a capital market solution that's good for capitalism, and then also the great social benefit of coming up with a solution that brings both sides together.
Have you seen that movie, The Big Short? This all sounds a little bit like bundling subprime mortgages to a bystander. Is everything going to be okay, Michael?
Am I allowed to plead the fifth here? Where's Bernie? Bernie, can you help?
Bernie, absolutely he can, for a fee.
I
think what I'm trying to say is you understand that to the lay person, phrases like securitizing risk pools sounds a little bit like a Jedi mind trick to convince you that everything is going to be okay and nothing can possibly go wrong.
Yeah. So fair point, and thank you for asking me to clarify. And you'll all forgive me on the investment.
He didn't mean that, really.
I didn't mean it. So there are ways of, as probably most know, there are ways of looking at risk and then funding that risk, and those who are investing in that risk require a certain rate of return. And this has been done, for example, pick a pharmaceutical company that has manufacturing facilities in a hurricane zone. And how do they insure against that risk? One of the ways, and this goes back about more than 20 years now, I was at a firm prior to my current firm that we helped to structure what was called CAT bonds or catastrophe bonds. So take Novartis, for example, if they have a manufacturing facility somewhere in a hurricane zone, you can price out that risk based on the probability that a hurricane is going to hit the manufacturing facility, that it will go down, and ask for the capital markets, pension funds, hedge funds, foundations, endowments, and so forth, to buy bonds that help insure that risk and have a rate of return for putting up their capital in case there is a catastrophic event. So the capital markets is clever. At the end of the day, the buy side, the buyers of that risk, can work with those who structure security types like equity or like debt or some hybrid of that to be able, no difference than insurance life tables and insurance tables in that regard, to be able to get to yes. Essentially, it's about getting to yes between, I think, the capital markets, the public sector, payers, and providers.
You see in 15 years' time quite different relationships between cancer centers, governments, academicians, and all of the bodies that are in this room today?
I mean, I do, but I'm an eternal optimist. My wife is here, and by the way, she'll judge me after this. My wife is here in the audience and knows that I really tend to look at things as glass half full, and I think this is a great venue for that. I have seen it at work. The Cancer Trust, with Columbia, Penn, Hopkins, and Sinai Comprehensive Cancer Centers working, in this case with Celgene Corporation, on a 10-year commitment to one another to discover, not just research, to discover, research, develop, and commercialize cancer therapeutics and diagnostics. Government is starting to think more about this. Certainly government outside of the US is thinking about this in conjunction with some of the larger pharmaceutical companies domiciled in those countries. And I think if the private side also respects the academic world, public mission, the advancement of faculty and their development, the ability to publish. We're seeing more, I think, collaboration than ever before in that regard. And we've seen a lot of collaboration that Bristol Myers has stimulated, certainly Novartis, Mike Bloomberg, and others, the Cancer Trust, and a number of other examples of that. And I think it's just a matter of time before all of these constellations come together, really around patients.
I think we appreciate your careful and structured analysis of this, and we serve you notice that your contributions will be needed at venues like this and in this field in the future, hopefully very soon.
And it'd be our great honor, so thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Michael.